call to order the special meeting for Monday, October 26th for Tonganoxie Board of Education. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
Make a motion to approve the agenda.
Is there a second?
I second.
It's been moved and seconded by Chris and Stephanie. All in favor, please raise your right hand. And motion carried. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
Make a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's Chris and Justin. All in favor, please raise your right hand. All right, motion carried. With that, we'll move into presentations. Dustin, it's all you.
Right.
Thanks for waiting.
Yeah, you bet. Good to see everyone. Wasn't sure if I was echoing or not, but good to see everyone. Really just a kind of a follow-up to a conversation that we've been having that's been ongoing since the election started, and really relates to just updating and monitoring the plan of finance for the bond issue. And obviously over time circumstances change. We think about valuation as a factor in the plan of finance, state aid as a factor. And in this case, one of the factors which is somewhat unusual is, hey, what happens when we have remaining proceeds available or our project comes in under budget? What are some of the options available to the district under those circumstances? And so I really wanted just to maybe spend a few minutes visiting about what some of those options look like to the district. And really there's, I maybe felt three options. I would say that these options aren't something that needs to be decided on the day. These are somewhat ongoing and oftentimes mostly made when a project is completed and all the projects that were intended to be completed are done. Is typically when we start finalizing some of these conversations, but I do commend the district for being very proactive in this approach and looking at this and thinking about this well in advance of when that may occur. But typically when we think about what some of those options look like, we typically look at how do we pay for other things that maybe weren't on the original budget, but now we have money to spend on. What are some of those projects? When can they be completed? How much are they? Are they within the scope of what was approved by voters? The second thing would be is how do we provide some level of mill levy relief? So keeping in mind when the funds currently on hand are in a project fund, that project fund can only be used to pay for things that were authorized by voters within the ballot question. Oftentimes what happens is once that project's been completed, we can always transfer funds to what we call the bond and interest fund, which is the fund that's being used to help repay the bonds. When those funds are transferred to the bond fund, we can use them for a couple of different things. We can use them for what we call mill levy relief. Which means basically is we add funds to that bond fund, which allows us then to lower our bond and interest mill levy, which provides mill levy relief. We can put those funds in that account and keep our mill levy the same. And then at some point in time, we can, rather than having our bonds amortize over 25 years, at some point in time, if we refinance, we can always say, well, how about we keep things the same and now we pay them off over 20 years versus 25 years. That could be an option. Or I think the last alternative, which would be number 4, would be is a combination of all those things, right? So when we think about the amount of dollars available, right? So whatever that may be at the conclusion of the project, if we figure out what are our objectives, both from a project perspective, but from a budget perspective, at that point in time, we can really kind of hone in on really what option is most suitable given the circumstances at that particular time. How it relates to the plan of finance is important, right? Because there's some things in the plan of finance that none of us control, one of them being valuation changes, right? And the other being state aid on bonds. So just as an example, the state aid on these bonds, I think we had projected it being 14% initially. It came in at 9% this year, right? So state aid was lower than what was originally projected. Again, state aid changes every single year. And so as that formula gets adjusted every year, state aid may go back up, it may go back down, but we need to make sure we have a plan in place to help absorb any changes in that state aid component. So that's one thing, and obviously valuation being another. So you may recall that based upon recent trends, we're assuming a 4% valuation growth for the first 2 years through 22, and then we're assuming a 2% valuation growth thereafter. again, things change over time, recessions occur, things change from a development perspective. We may see fluctuations in that in both directions, both higher than what we projected, and then maybe lower than what we projected. And so making sure that, again, we continue to take snapshots every single year like we did this year and last year of where do we stand based on what we know today is important to really understand what our options are in the future as well. So I want to maybe spend just a few minutes going through this, because I think maybe one of the questions I would have if I was in your position is to say, if we do have money, right, if we have funds that we want to apply to our budget at some point in time, what millage impact does that have, okay? So I really wanted to share with you is what this may look like as one of those options. So the very first page of this, okay, is really the same status quo analysis we've been showing since the inception of this project, but it's a updated for this year's budget information. Okay, so new valuations, new state aid, the mill levy at the 23.14 mils, your cash balance in that fund. Okay, so what this is showing, if you look on the far right hand column, is showing that here's the mill levy we communicated to voters. Here's what this mill levy looks like if we continue this for the remaining life of the bonds. Here's our fund balance, right? So our fund balance shows that we're using some of our fund balance each year through probably 2025, it looks like, through 2025 to maintain our balance. And if you remember, when our original plan, going back to the very beginning, we had originally included in this plan putting money into this fund up front to help keep our mill levy the same, but because interest rates and valuation were better than what we had anticipated, I wanted to show you what this looked like without putting any additional funds in the bond fund. It was only an increase in the mills is what I'm illustrating here. Okay. So again, things look great, but again, next year if all of a sudden something changes, now we rather than growing at 4%, maybe we lose 5% of valuation. Again, not saying it's going to happen, but if it does, we need to be prepared financially to make sure we make the adjustments in our financial plan to ultimately make sure that we keep our mill levy what we told voters it would be. And I think that's our ultimate goal.
I just want to make sure, I mean, everybody's following along with the fund balance. The second from the right is the one that's the cash that we have in the bank in that fund.
Correct.
And I mean, and then,
It can be
like
used
you
for
said,
no purpose.
we only went up 3 mils, but we had a strong balance, let's say, in that account, I guess, carried over. But to keep that at just 3 mils to pay for that, we're actually using a lot of our cash until our valuation increases.
That's correct. Yep. Yep. And so as our valuation changes or our state aid changes every year, that may impact that cash balance, right? Or it may impact how much we need to transfer from our project fund into our bond fund to help maintain our mill levy. Okay. So initially, if I recall correctly, I think we were looking at $2 million. So initially, the plan was we were going to put $2 million at closing of bonds into this account for a stabilizing impact. And again, I wanted to show you what it looked like without that $2 million, just so you can see that, hey, our valuation was better than what we had anticipated, number one, and number two is interest rates are better. The one thing that was maybe counterintuitive is our state aid went from 14% down to 9%, so we needed to adjust for that as well. So the next page is the scenario that says, okay, if one of our objectives at some point in time is to deposit $3 million, and so when we look at the plan of finance, when the bonds were sold, and I'll get into some bond math here, but when the bonds were sold, through the bond sale process, there was about $3.5 million of premium that was generated from the bond sale. That $3.5 million can be used for project purposes, so it's deposited into the project fund. But I wanted to show here is if we decide to say, you know what, we're really good on our project side of things. We're under budget. We have money that can be spent for other purposes. We really don't need it for projects. What is the impact if we transfer that $3 million? And I'm using $3 million. If we transfer that $3 million to our bond fund, what impact does it have on our fund balances, okay? So as a hypothetical, if this were to occur this fiscal year, so before the end of the year, if we were to transfer that $3 million into the bond fund for mill levy purposes, you can see what it does to our fund balance. So really what I wanted to show here is, if we maintain that 23.14 mils, okay, and we deposit $3 million, assuming all other variables stay the same, okay, our fund balance is pretty strong, okay? In this example, if the option is, you know what, we really want to keep our mill levy the same, because our objective maybe at some point in time is to pay off these bonds before 2045, okay? This would be the alternative or the option that would allow you to do that, okay? So by building that fund balance up, let's say we get to the point of these bonds are prepayable in 25 or 26. So in 2025 or 26, these bonds become eligible to be prepaid. Now we've built up a fund balance so that when we decide that we want to refinance them to prepay them, now we can re-amortize over a shorter period of time and pay them off sooner than what we had anticipated. Okay, so there's a strategy there, okay? The next strategy would be, if we deposit $3 million into the account this year, what sort of budget flexibility do we have for next year's budget? So that'd be 21-22 budget. How much budget flexibility do we have to lower our mill levy as soon as possible and still maintain a relatively healthy fund balance? Okay, so the last page. Okay, shows just that. So if we looked at $3 million deposit, beginning with the 21-22 budget, we could lower our mill levy from 23.14 mils to 21.75 mils. Okay, so what about that? A mil and a half?
1.39.
1.39 mils. Okay. So now so the other part of this too is, and that's immediate, right? So you can say, well, is a mill valuable to me now? Okay, is the question. Number one is, the longer, so go to page number 2. The longer you defer the mill levy drop, the greater the potential drop could be in future years. Okay, so as we build up more fund balance over time, the greater the mill levy drop can be in future years. Because you think about it, $3 million divided by almost 23 years, not significant from a impact from a mill levy perspective, right? But now you say, okay, I built my fund balance up, and now my fund balance in the year 2000 and now my fund balance in the year 2030, for example, is now 4.4 million. Okay, now I drop my mill levy. Maybe it probably has more impact. Okay. So there's a little bit of strategy there. Again, I always say that to some extent it's your ability to do something may change every single year. Okay, so we may say, yeah, a mill drop is great next year, but the reality is if in 2 years we have a recession, right, and now our valuations have dropped like they did back in 2008, 9, 10, you may need to, basically we may need to increase that back up. So I think it's important as you think about the strategies and the options, right? Again, I don't think it needs to be made today, but usually every single budget cycle when we start looking at budget options, particularly when the project's been completed, right, that becomes a key part, because now we know exactly, we have a very clear picture of what the circumstances are with respect to the dollars remaining, and then it's a matter of developing a plan to figure out what to do with those dollars. So I'll pause there and digest numbers and ask questions.
So the scenario that's on page 2, where you build up the really large fund balance, the reality is you'd really never build up that high a fund balance, because at some point when there was an option to refinance and re-amortize those bonds, you would redo it. So So even though we're showing 8.5 million in that fund balance in 2045, you've
You'd never get
refinanced,
there.
you'd never get there.
Yeah, that was more of a hypothetical.
Right,
say.
right, I
Yeah,
get you, gotcha.
yeah, it's more, yeah, you're absolutely correct. So it'd be either, if my fund balance grows, now I'm accelerating my bond repayment, number one, or number two is my mill levy drop could be more significant in future years.
So when you think about keeping the mill consistent, right? Not bouncing it all over every year. Other than the court of public opinion, are there, what are the reasons you'd want it to be consistent? I mean, as a taxpayer, I know why I want it to be consistent, but are there other factors that play into that, or is it primarily the court of public opinion?
I mean, I think there's some level of mill levy strategy with not only bonds, but with the total district mill levy, right? So, again, this may not be your situation, but hypothetically, let's say that you were at 7 mills in capital outlay, but you wanted to go to 8 and keep your overall mill levy the same. And let's say that, that's 3 years down the road, and if you kept your bond mill levy the same up until that point, now you can say, okay, I'm gonna drop bond interest by mill, I'm gonna transfer that over to capital outlay, and still keep my overall mill levy the same. So I think that would be one budgetary strategy. I think the other strategy too is thinking, again, it's probably not the case now, but at some point in time, if you were a district that said, you know what, now we have more capital needs, and now we need to figure out how we're gonna to fund another project with a bond issue, now it becomes, hey, we've managed our mill levy, and now we can do a project and finance it over 10 years and still keep our mill levy where it's at. So it kind of depends on where you are in that process, but those would be some strategies that would be important from both a budgetary and capital perspective.
For any near-term, I keep asking all the questions, so.
Good. All right,
For any near-term priorities that were within the scope of the bond, is there any advantage or disadvantage to paying for those out of the bond versus capital expenditure? Or just advantages or disadvantages either way?
No, I don't think so. I would say that, generally speaking, there's, I think there's gonna be a capital outlay plan, or a long-term capital outlay plan for the capital outlay fund. There may be some big ticket items that may make sense to pay for out of bond proceeds, as long as they're eligible expenses to be paid for out of them. I think the challenge is that, bond projects are tough, right? They're tough, it's a long planning process, they're tough to get approved, and so I think there's gonna be a balancing act to figure out, here's our list of other items that necessarily weren't planned for, which of those items we wanna put in our capital outlay plan, and which items we wanna put in our, hey, let's pay for them out of the bond proceeds plan.
Is a fund just a balance that's in some account?
yes.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's part of the report from Lori with all the deposit. I mean, it's our math. We have a massive amount of deposits on,
Right,
but it's a portion that's allocated to that bond interest fund.
right.
How's that money working for us right now? I mean, are we earning, I
Uh,
know we're not earning much.
But it can be invested, so, you bring a good point. So, on the, I don't know, Laura may have more information on the bond interest fund itself. I would say the project fund, which has been invested, and obviously the timing of that investment worked out much better because that was before COVID happened, and so the investments on the bond dollars were locked in before COVID hit and the market dropped. I would say that as those investments roll off, right, obviously they're gonna be either held in cash or reinvested until they're needed, and then obviously if they're reinvested, the return's gonna be nominal. But I would say that probably the bond fund is also invested at some level as well. The budgetary fund. So when I say bond fund, there's a bond interest fund, which is your budgetary fund, and then there's a project fund, which is your bond dollars.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get there, just how many different buckets do we have? So we have the bond fund.
And that's the bond fund is when we levy the 23 mills,
Yes.
that's where the revenues are going into to make annual principal and interest payments.
So tax goes into that for the mill levy. And then we have the project fund.
Right, which is the bond dollars for, which, yeah, bond dollars to pay for the project.
Which get moved, we're using some local banks and different places to.
Yeah, we got like 3 out.
If we were to give some mill relief, but something happens, recession, whatever, we still have the authorization that we, while it may not be popular, that we would need to increase that mill back up to what the voters approved.
So, that's a really good question. So the voters didn't approve the mill levy, okay? The mill levy, the voters approved the issuance of the bonds. And the
Which
mill
had
levy
an
was.
approximate
was-
mill levy
yeah, was communicated.
increase that would go with it.
So if something, worst case scenario, we would have to levy whatever was needed to
Service
make the
them.
bond payment. So, to answer your
So
question.
the three mills was an estimate based on everything that we knew at the time.
Exactly right.
If it went to 1, if it went to 5, voters, we all have to pay it regardless.
Correct, yeah. Yep, so if we decide, hey, we wanna drop this down 1 mil, but reality is in 5 years because of certain circumstances, that mill levy need to be increased to make the payment, that, the board has the authority to do that.
Our original analysis, when we got it passed, included 2 mills going into the
2 million.
2 million, I mean.
That was
the
before-
Premium, an estimated premium amount going into that fund to keep everything
Correct.
square.
And that was before the board called the election based upon interest rates at that time.
Yeah, I mean, interest rates, I don't even know if we knew, it would've been September, we wouldn't even have last year's valuations at that time, the valuations went up.
So
They're
things
strong.
turned out better, which then the last analysis we ran was showing, hey, here's our snapshot now, we don't need it in the premium now. But keep in mind, we earmarked X amount to be put in there at some point in time if we needed it to be.
And then, I mean, we don't have it, but if I recall, like, we had that 20 years of property valuation history in some of the different reports. And maybe it went negative once, but I mean, it was either, I think it only went below 0 once. I mean, either held flat or it wasn't,
Yeah.
we didn't have high growth all the time, but I think it only dipped like less than 1%.
It was very consistent, so even through the downturn, it was very consistent, and in fact, in recent years, it had, obviously, we've experienced a very healthy growth.
So as I look at the different fund balance, I don't have an understanding of what a reasonable or target fund balance is. I would assume the fund balance, the target value that you should carry in that fund balance would factor in your total debt.
Yes.
Your growth projections, your valuation projections, all that. The more risk there is, then the more you would want in that fund balance. Like the higher the debt is, the more you want in that fund balance.
Yep.
The more unpredictable, growth is and that kind of stuff, or markets. So,
What's the right number?
what's a, I would say what the right number is, but what's a range?
Yeah,
Let's say
that's-
you
no,
do
that's-
80% of districts, what are they targeting as far as a range? Or is there no pattern whatsoever, or?
Well, there's a wide range, okay,
Yes.
there's a really, really wide range, there's some districts who have more than 100% of their bond payment in reserve. Okay, so in that case, it'd be, again, when I say bond payment, I'm gonna say before state aid, so if we look at our payments, we're about $5.5 million is what our annual payment is before we receive state aid. So some districts are over 100%, some districts are less than 10%, okay? I would tell you from a planning perspective, we're gonna try to target between 20 and 50%, depending upon the district and the circumstances.
Okay.
So that fund balance would cover somewhere between 20 and 50% of the debt service, and the state aid, motor vehicle revenue, whatever would cover the delta.
Well, it's not necessarily what your annual payment is, so we're thinking about, what you're referring to is, what revenues are we using each year to make our annual payment? I'm thinking more in terms of that fund balance should be, in any given year, somewhere between 20 and 50% of what our total payment's gonna be. And the reason why we have that there is because if something unforeseen were to happen, now we know we have some cushion there to absorb drop in state aid or a drop in valuation, and we have a balance there to help ourselves keep our mill levy the same.
So when you say the 5.5 annual bond payment, that's the total quote-unquote debt service.
Total debt service for all
Right.
bond issues, correct, 5.5 million.
And Dustin and I talked, I mean, I had kind of a similar question as you, Drew, when we did our budget, because our bond, the bond fund has quite a bit of cash in it. I had to kind of walk through this illustration, but then I think part of it is, it's a little light here, but we've got like 3.6 or close to, we've got the premium that's sitting in the project fund right now.
Right. So, as, you know, so even during this budget process, when we talked about this year's budget, we looked at this sheet, the very first sheet, and said, here's where we're at now. Now, what we need to do probably sometime around next budget year is make a determination is, depending upon state aid evaluation in 21, at that point in time, do we need to transfer some of those dollars back into this fund to make sure that we're maintaining and keeping that healthy reserve level, fund balance level.
Would you say that again, just to make sure I?
Yeah, so I think every budget year, so no different, you know, same with this budget year.
Right.
We have looked at this snapshot and said, okay, here's what we know today. Our fund balance is at a percentage that is appropriate this year. Depending upon next year's valuation, next year's state aid, we may need to make a determination that we transfer some of that premium from our project fund
Okay.
back into our bond fund to help maintain a healthy reserve.
And that premium is at you put in here 3 million, but it's
It is.
actually closer to,
It's like 3.5 million.
okay.
I think I said at the last meeting it was 4.5, but there was 500,000 of fees taken out, so it's like 3.9.
Yeah, maybe 3. So,
Let's keep talking about it, because it keeps
you
going
know,
up. I like
so
it.
I guess.
Well, it's going down this time from what I said last time.
I was thinking it was around 3.9.
51.4.
Okay, so we're being
Yeah.
conservative with that.
Yeah,
So
right.
you can then, is there any time constraints or timing limitations on when you can move from the project fund back into the bond fund? Or can that be done at any time, or?
So I guess the first thing is as needed, okay,
Okay.
but, there are some time limitations, and those time limitations relate to some IRS regulations regarding spend down requirements.
Okay.
So, again, it's very loose, and the reason I say it's very loose is because if we don't spend money as required by the IRS, the only penalty to the school district is we must rebate any interest earnings that we've earned that are above the arbitrage yield on the bonds. Okay, so let's just say that our investment earnings are 4% and our bonds are at 3%, okay, it's a 1% difference.
Yep.
Okay, if we don't spend the money like the IRS wants us to, we have to rebate back to the federal government that 1% earnings. Okay, now, reality is haven't been in that situation since 2007. Okay, so in practice, okay, if we don't spend the money like we're supposed to, there's no penalty. Okay, so I say that, but I would tell you that by the time we get to the conclusion of the project, that is the time period where we typically make some decisions about, okay, are we gonna transfer it, or are we not gonna transfer it, or are we gonna spend it on something else?
And the transfer only goes one way, you can't come back out of the
Yes,
fund.
absolutely.
But Dustin, it does look like if we didn't transfer that fund balance on this first page, we meet the 20 to 50%.
Yeah, and that's where I think as we look at budget for even next year, that's when we thought, okay, well, we don't need to do it right now, but as we're talking next year, once we get the new valuations, that's when we then say, okay, based upon this year's valuation, is it now time to transfer a portion of that or all of that into that? That's a good one.
And you're talking, that's the first page where no
Yeah.
money is.
Yep, correct, this is the snapshot we looked at for this year's budget.
Right.
Nothing changes.
Nothing changed.
And if you transferred that in, just because we did, I mean, you could transfer money in to build up the fund balance so that it meets a minimum threshold, but the mill levy is an annual decision. I mean, basically.
They're kind of two separate things. I mean, they're related because we're gonna, I mean, ideally, I think it really depends upon board's objective. If the board's objective is, say, we wanna try to keep things the same, then it may say, well, maybe this year we only do $1 million. And then we reevaluate in a year and decide, okay, well, do we need to do more or less, or, you know.
Yeah,
whatever it
and
may
I
be.
realize once it goes in there,
You
it's,
can't.
you can't get it back, but if you put 3 million in there, and then you decided you wanted, in 2 years, you wanted to help that build up, I mean, we could still bring down the mill levy.
Yeah, I
later.
think, yeah, and that's actually a good point, because it may be, hey, let's put in 3 million now, but when the project's completed, you may say, well, now, we have $5 million left over. I know I can do project X, Y, and Z, and now I still have $2 million left over. We can put $2 more million into that account, and at that point in time, maybe the mill levy impact is different, right? Maybe now it's maybe it's $1.5 million or 2 mils or 2.5 mils, whatever it may be. But it may be more meaningful at some point down the road too. Or maybe, hey, we'll put $5 million in there, and now we're that much closer to 2025 when we can refinance it, and now we're paying it off earlier too. Or maybe it's a combination of both.
2025, that only impacts the 2019 issues, right?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
So which of those other issues, I know that you and Jim have been talking about that there are some others that could be refinanced, and so which of those?
Right now, we're monitoring the 13A bonds, is what we're monitoring right now. So as we get, and again, keep in mind, that there are prepayment dates on bond issues. And so, as we get closer to those prepayment dates, refinancings become more efficient. And so we're watching that one really closely to make sure we're doing it at the right time, but as long as interest rates remain favorable, which we think they will, I mean, we don't see any indication of rates going up, the longer we can wait to refinance, the more savings that will be generated by the school district. So that we're watching that very frequently.
At what point does the project fund be required to go down to, the project fund is, we did the bond for the high school project. At what point does that fund, I assume it gets closed at some point or zeroed out, and all of it goes into, does all of it go into if anything left in there, does it all have to go into the bond fund? Does it go somewhere else, or?
Has to go to the bond fund.
Has to go to the bond fund, okay.
The only way it can go to another fund is if the district spent, since the election, if the district has spent money at a capital outlay on something that could have been that bond proceeds could have been used for, you can go back and reimburse capital outlay with bond funds at some point in time. That's the only other exception.
How long do we have to do that, though?
That was my next question.
Well, usually it's,
Good job.
well, we can't reimburse anything before the election is approved, okay? But typically it's gonna be is once the project has been completed, at that point, we need to make those decisions about, within a reasonable time period, not, doesn't mean that same day, but within, call it 6-month period, try to make those decisions about where funds go.
Okay. What defines when the project is quote unquote done?
The construction side?
No.
No, the bond itself?
As far as,
Well, I would say it's more related to the construction question of, okay, when are we in, when are all the punch lists? I presume there's probably gonna be some sort of completion certificate, probably
Yep,
by.
there'll be a substantial completion, final punch list,
So-
that kind of stuff. So it's tied to that. So if where the reasoning for my question was, because if at the end of the project, or as you approach the end of the project, you decided to even, you know, to move money over from the project fund or have the project fund do some additional work, which may or may not even be done by under the same exact contract, that you could still, because I don't know that the project is defined by a particular contract.
No, it's pretty broad.
It's pretty broad,
Improvements
right?
to-
So-
I mean, I'm misquoting, but it's pretty broad, the improvements to the school facilities. It's not tied to
Yes,
PHS,
district facilities.
district facilities.
So I've had districts that have, I mean, it's taken them a while to figure that out.
Yeah.
So I would tell you that as, and then there's not a definitive date, because if there's a plan is good, right? If it's like, well, we don't know, we're just gonna leave it in there, or we don't, that's probably not okay. There's like,
Yes.
it may take a couple years, but here's what we think we're gonna spend this on. They're gonna be okay with that.
Okay, that's where I was getting at, was to where you had some flexibility, and it's not just that you have a, yeah, cause if it's not as if, hey, we're finished with the main construction, accountant Gordon's punch list is coming done, and then because of timing constraints, that the next summer would be the opportune time to do another project under that. You could have a gap there in activity,
Yes.
but keep that project fund open.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
That's a little unrelated, but if we continue at our valuation increases of around 9 to 9.3% for the next 3 or 4 years, does that have much of a factor on our it wouldn't affect our capital outlay mill levy. It would affect our operating.
It would, I mean, I would say that it would have a significant impact to this, I mean, in a
That's
positive.
what
yeah,
so
in a
how does
positive.
that,
Well, so it basically means that, I mean, if we had projected, say, 2%, right, but now we're going at even 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right?
okay,
Basically that, you know, this scenario changes drastically, because now I'm showing you a mill levy drop of something more.
that's what I'm wondering. That's
Because
my,
we need less mills, right, on higher valuation, we need less mills to cover the,
but let's say over a 3 to 4 year period, is that something that we should take a really hard look at as we evaluate our strategy?
well, I think it just becomes part of the plan that we continue to evaluate every year, right, and I think that's why I think it's, you make me think, well, geez, Dustin, give me a plan, right?
Yeah.
But I think it changes every year. I mean, I think your circumstances, I mean, if we grow at 9%, I may be back here in 2 years saying, geez, we're in a great position, right? Now we're looking at refinancing bonds, we have $5 million left over, and now we're either paying out them quicker, or we're saying, hey, our mill levy drop is gonna be 1 1/4, now it's gonna be 3 months, right?
Yeah, right.
So I think there's a lot of those variables that we don't know yet to figure out what's the best solution. I mean, I think that they're all good solutions, and you're actually in a good position that you're in. And it's just maybe allowing the more we know over time, the better you're gonna be in position to make those decisions and figure out what the best solution is.
I just noticed for my tax bill, man, I hope it doesn't keep going 9%.
Well,
Because
if
it's a
the
double-edged
valuation
sword.
goes up 9%, we
Yeah.
should be correspondingly reducing the mill levy.
Yep.
I mean, but I mean, I think it factors in what he's saying in terms of how much you put in there, how much you prepay it, and where you put it at.
I would love, I mean, in my world, right, when we come back 5 years after, or 6 years after, or 7 years after a bond project, and we say, geez, you know what? You're in a great financial position, you've managed your mill levy the way you should manage it. You have leftover money over, our valuations have been better than what we anticipated. And we're talking about saving millions of dollars because now we're paying it off sooner than what we had thought. It's a pretty good story.
But, I mean, we've got some pretty low yielding bonds. I mean, so I guess it seemed like refinancing it to save money, unless you're knocking off substantial years, is gonna be, I mean, a challenge, I would think.
It could be, depends on the market environment,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it just depends on the market environment.
Yeah, I never thought it'd get.
Because you think about
low
it,
for so many years.
to some extent, though, you think about, well, initially it was a 25-year financing, right? But now 5 years down the road and we're knocking out 5 years off the end, now it's a 15, now we're financing over basically over 15 years. So we're financing 25-year rates, now we're 15 years to some extent. You know, just the change in the yield curve and where you're at.
Well, another thing that's a factor is, based upon our enrollment growth, you know, and the assumptions that go into that, when would we think that we might need the next bond project and starting to plug that in? Because my position is, we've been consistent historically. Every time we need to expand, we've had to increase the mill levy. And at some point in time, and we got close in this election, you get to the point to where it's as high as what the voters will pass. So it's looking at, is there a strategy that we can put together that, you know, if we keep at a 1 point, you know, just over 1% average annual growth in enrollment, you know, we're looking at capacity on this building at 1,200 in 2039, and that's kind of the mid-level. If you go with the high growth, it's sooner, low growth, it's past 2045, and what would that look like? That goes into our capital planning as a board. Then I would assume that if we got into a capital plan like that, we could have some potential scenarios that then we could plug into this model.
Absolutely.
And see how what that
Yes,
looks like.
yeah, 100%. Yeah, no question. It's very common, especially with growing districts. You really want to create a long-term financial plan to meet what your capital needs are. And the objective of those districts that are growing is, we never want to come back with a mill levy increase. We want to make sure we have a plan that says, as we're growing, or as our bonds are falling off, we're able to layer in new projects to handle our growth while keeping our mill levy the same.
Right.
That's our objective.
With, the fact is, we're buying a lot more square footage right now, which is going to increase our, you know, Mitch has more things to fix now, or he will at the end of this, than he does now, and so then we also have factored in that growth of operation and maintenance cost, and, you know, by that time, you know, assuming our last meeting, and every 15 years, we need to replace, let's say, rooftop units. We've already replaced every rooftop unit in this place by then. Even the brand new ones that we just bought have, by the 2039, everything's been completely replaced once, at least. So then factoring that expenditure growth over time too.
Yeah, that's likely in the capital outlay budget.
Right, but that all goes into the
If
mill
we spread
levy.
it out.
Because the other thing that I think about is, I would like to see the district in a position to where we can maintain what we have without the need of bond funds. So that we are self-sustainable, so that if we didn't have growth, our capital outlay would be budgeted such that we could keep replacing air handling units, you know, rooftop units, and keep things going without having to rely on bond money.
Yeah, you don't want to have to borrow to.
Right,
go
you
maintenance.
can borrow to buy a new car, but you don't want to be borrowing to change the oil and replace tires.
So one of the things that Mitch and I have talked about a lot, Drew, is to try to develop a HVAC plan where that all doesn't come together at one time. Because that's what would catch us big time. So if he can develop a plan where things are spaced out like 5-year increments,
Yeah.
then we can manage that a lot easier with our own capital.
It's not just that, it's parking lots, it's.
Oh, but yes, I mean, but
buses.
there are some definite big ticket items.
We've done a good job with the buses, I think, that we
We're making
have
progress.
that plan right now. So the buses are on a sustainable plan, but other things.
We just don't want everything to happen in.
Oh, yeah, we don't want
Swamp.
to get surprised.
Yes.
Or try to win and possibly do.
I mean, and some of that with the growth, it's captured in the valuation. I mean, if the valuation's going up, that's when you're gonna have more I mean, theoretically,
Yeah, but-
we're building more houses.
Yeah, but you're not,
Both the valuation and the mill are up 30% plus over the last 4 years, so they can't both keep going like that.
No, but I mean, the number of students.
Yeah, I know.
That helps.
What we don't wanna run into is where our enrollment growth percentage-wise is outpacing our, valuation growth, cause that can happen. I was looking at some districts around here and where their valuation growth, because it was more, the tax base was more residential versus commercial, all those houses coming in, it starts to outpace and you get upside down, so your enrollment growth is growing more than your valuation growth, and every year it's, is that a possibility?
Yeah, it is, and the offsetting factor that does help the situation is state aid on bonds, right?
Yeah.
So it can be, basically you're becoming, because your enrollment's growing at higher capacity, you're becoming more poor on a per pupil basis. And so therefore you're gonna be driving more state aid to equalize you. So they're
But
good
then
now.
at that point in time, it's out of your hands, it's more, you're relying on the state
Yeah.
versus, which is a risk.
Right.
Any other questions for Dustin?
Your recommendation for timing, this once again is to, I mean, the board is sitting here looking at all sorts of different alternatives, but, are we looking to revisit this at the end of construction? Or do we continue to monitor it as we move forward?
Yeah, what I'm hearing is we need, when we go to the budget next year, we need to be taking a hard
That's-
look. Because, I mean, in November, we'll get valuations in November. We'll have some idea where the project status is. We'll still have the premium sitting there, and we can decide if we need to allocate some of that premium to get the,
Yeah.
either the mill levy down or the fund balance up, or a combination of both, of some
Yeah,
sort.
I think I would say next budget, as you're looking at your next year's budget, that's probably the next time, and then intermittently, and I mean, by the next budget year, so that'd be 2022, you probably have a project probably done, right? That's,
Supposed to be by December 22.
yeah, so, yeah, to some extent, I think it's, during the budget cycle, I think it's gonna be important between now and then, as things arise in between.
Well, I think one of the big things the board kind of wanted to see is like the analysis on the last page, just if you put all that money into the bump fund, what is the impact on the mill? I mean,
3 million.
yeah.
Well, that assumes, that's
About
just.
half a mil per $1 million,
Yeah.
rough numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, just to get an idea for,
Yeah, no,
I mean, we're pretty highly leveraged, and like Justin pointed out, we've had rapid valuation growth and mill levy growth both, so there's a lot of desire for a little relief from the
Yeah.
taxpayers, patrons.
when I was doing this, I was like, if I were in your shoes, this is what I would wanna know, and so I think that's, I figured that was gonna be something that, to say, okay, what's the value of that, and what does that really mean to us in terms of mills?
Yeah, and this includes only the premium, that doesn't, if there was given our current forecast for the project itself, that what we're having under contract on the project fund, which there's still a lot of money yet to be committed, and so that can change. But I would assume there's also the possibility that if the current projections hold true, that there is also then some money in addition to the premium funds, just from project savings that are set in that project fund, that we could also then have, but that's a ways out. That's correct?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? Nicole, I know there's at least one person dying to get to a soccer game.
It's 1-0. Want to do that by 1?
We should have
I didn't even look.
we should have live streamed the game in the back. I guess that'd been a little insulting to Dustin, to just acting like that.
Thank you, Dustin.
But-
Thank you, good to see everyone.
Thank you for
Appreciate it.
that. All right, with that, the next item is just kind of working, touching base, I guess more of a discussion on the capital outlay items, the rubric. don't know, I think everybody got an updated sheet from Lauren and Aaron, kind of after the last discussion, that kind of outlined some of these projects. I mean, wasn't really intending, I guess, tonight to spend hours and hours rehashing all the projects and working through all that, but I know we're trying to develop the rubric and talk about some of these in some manner of about moving forward on this. I guess just my 2 cents looking over some of this stuff is some of these small items that are within Lauren's purview, like 6, 7, and 8 on this list. I mean, if they need done, I think they just need done in their maintenance, and I don't really see where they really need to be on our capital outlay plan. But and I think we approved at the last meeting to vote the HVAC replacement to run through capital outlay. The only other real conversations I know Lauren and I have had is just a little bit about the lighting at Beatty Field is 32 years old, and I guess it's kind of a hit or miss. I guess Mitch has the magic touch about getting the lights on, but
They turn on 9 of those, Cody, so the 3 that are out.
and there's been some discussions with the vendor about wintertime pricing and installation on that, and I guess again, everybody can have their own thoughts on how we keep moving this forward, but I was gonna just encourage Lauren to kind of get some bids and start, I mean, we don't, and bring it into us and see where we're at, sitting on capital outlay, not necessarily the bond, and try to keep some of this maintenance and things moving forward as we're working through this. But, and that's about, I didn't really spend a lot of time on the rubric, that's just my review of kind of the plan and different things. I don't know if Lauren has any thoughts or any other.
No, as far as the lights, I'll have bids, not just from Musco, but from Greenbush. They have some people, some vendors that can help jump in on that. Some other local vendors are also involved in that process, but I was targeting December probably for bringing people in and maybe having a presentation about their bids.
Is there an option for like with that, and then LEDs as an upgrade, or is LEDs the
I would
modern
say
technology?
I can speak for everybody's heading to LEDs. Is that what you mean, or?
Well, cause if you look at it like a maintenance project, it's like, hey, they need to be replaced, there's electrical that needs to be done, and, is a like-for-like replacement, and, looking at that as the base case option, and then what's the added value for the LEDs? And I would imagine that most people are making that decision because LED pricing is going down to the point to where, with energy cost and that kind of stuff, and maybe the quality of light, if there's actually a performance difference.
They'll bring all that out.
Right, that's what I'd be interested in seeing is, hey, we look at it as a maintenance project, hey, they're at their end of their life, we know that they're unreliable to some extent. There's no reason to believe that at some point in time, it's not gonna be 3 lights that are out every time, it's gonna be more than that. So it's time, and then look at that as a base case, and then say, oh, well, there's only so much of an adder to go to LEDs, and here's the performance improvements that you get, and here's how that compares to what the target lighting levels are for a field. So that then we can say, okay, yes, that extra money may or may not be worth that extra cost. If there even is an extra cost, I don't know.
To upgrade?
Yeah, to go from a traditional.
Oh, gosh, yes. I mean, there is. It's not as high as it was 6 years ago.
Right.
But yes, I mean, we'll bring all that out.
That would be interesting for me to see.
The people that are presenting have all that information.
Right.
They do. I guess my question for Drew is just that everybody does everybody understand the process that with the rubric? I mean, I don't know if you want to kind of address that.
Well, the number one thing is, and this kind of plays in not just to this discussion, but overall for a planning, and this is the board members' really focus is, what is our priorities? How do we want to prioritize things? Because if we get into a long-term plan, that's exactly what we're going to be talking about, is what is important to us. And I think it's it's our responsibility, in my opinion, it's our responsibility to communicate that clearly to the administration so that as they look at opportunities, they understand what's important to the board, members of the board, and there's alignment so that we have less redirection in these meetings, we have less time, you know, we're all volunteers, you know, voted into this position, but then that would reduce the amount of time that we need to be involved, because instead of doing it ad hoc at the moment, communicating we've already established in a clear way what our priorities are.
Do we need just a work session with the board to
Yes.
discuss?
That's my opinion. To me, that's the only way that I think we can actually work through that.
That would cut out a lot of time. I mean, that would help bring this all together, I think.
Yeah, because I think everybody is coming at it with a perspective. Like Stephanie has great perspective on the education side of things. You know, Kaya is definitely focused on how the district is portrayed in the community. You know, Chris is focused on value, you know, and so we have all these different people with different perspectives that have different priorities. And being able to put that together so that you have direction.
Yeah, the way I look at it is, once the board gives me those priorities, then I can drill down bid-wise, timeline-wise, all those things, budgetarily-wise. But until we do that, I mean, I can give you this kind of stuff, but there's nothing else.
Right, but my hope is that if we establish that, then people start getting an alignment so that if somebody has an idea for something that's an investment, then they already know what we're trying to shoot for with regards to what's important to us. So they tailor and are thinking about that as they come up with those ideas, as far as, let's make sure there's an education component, let's make sure there's a community component, let's make sure there's, you know, a value, or let's understand what the long-term cost impacts are for operation and maintenance, and we have that defined before it even comes to the board, because they know we're going to be asking those questions.
I mean, I think that's all reasonable. I mean, do we all want, are you willing, and do we want Drew to facilitate that? I mean, I don't really think this is what we engaged Erin to do. I know she sat in at the last meeting and things like that, but, or do we wanna pursue some outside assistance, or do we want, or?
Well, DLR, I talked to Amber today. DLR is willing to help us with some of those visions.
DLR has a lot of experience.
Yeah, they do.
in
I think
planning
we're
and
meeting-
stuff, but I also don't, you know, depending upon what value that
Right.
effort is,
I don't wanna have them chase down rabbit holes if that's not what we wanna do. I mean, don't spend a lot of time on something that really isn't.
I know Amber would be, it's really not that much different than what Amber already did with the community in those meetings.
she said that.
Now they're just doing it with us.
Yeah. So those discussions are starting, we're doing them.
And-
Go ahead.
Dustin's presentation was very nice, but as a board, what is our comfort level for spending?
Yeah, no, that's.
And that's a priority right there. It's,
I mean, that's number one to me. Because if we go, I think these projects are great, and I like the direction, I like the focus. But if we spend, we don't look like very good stewards. And again, we don't have footings in the ground, we don't have steel in the air. And if we're out spending money before 20% of our projects even established, I think that's bad business. That's just my opinion. I think the project should be established further along, but I think we ought to nail these down and what dollar amount we're spending.
I
I don't
agree
think
with
you made
everything
this-
you said, but I don't think it costs us anything to put our priority list together, but I agree with you, I don't think we ought to be approving much of anything right now, personally.
yeah, now there is, I like the fact that, you know, because some of these things are maintenance items, and to me, that's a capital outlay expenditure, and if they need to happen, then that's a capital outlay expense. And if we ever need to put money back in there from the project fund, we have that flexibility to do it at a later to some degree, I mean, we're, you know, again, I'm really nervous about, you know, using borrowed money to do maintenance. That to me is it makes me nervous that we might be in an unsustainable mode if we don't have the discipline to use capital outlay for what capital outlay is intended for.
No, I think the intent is to develop the priorities.
Yes.
So then we can narrow down what the projects are before we just spend.
Yeah.
Now, somewhere in that process, we need to start defining
What do we
our
come-
limits of
That's
comfortability with
right.
certain amounts of dollars.
Right.
But I guess I think the biggest thing that Drew's trying to help us do is just pin down how are we gonna make these decisions, so we're not just picking
But
a dart or who squeaks the loudest
I
or
agree with you,
whatever.
but I don't want Lauren to say, hey, I'm not gonna spend any money on a maintenance project, because we still have a district to operate, right? From now until when we get that, and if there's a maintenance thing that comes up that it makes sense to do it, we follow that normal process for capital outlay, and we don't delay things.
I think we need to keep making progress.
Yes.
Yeah, and so that's what Mitch and I talk about all the time. So, and we can do that. And I understand the value of getting everybody's priorities together and comfort level with spending, that's perfect, so.
So
I,
it sounds like to me that the best thing, or the ask is maybe to reach out to DLR and see if they would help facilitate like a work session with the board with kind of the information we've built up to this point, and then we can all nail down some sort of
Is there,
rubric or
so
process.
is there anything that the board should be doing between now and the next 4 to 5 weeks? Should they be looking at these lists and kind of in their own mind prioritizing things that are important to them?
Well, in that list here, I just wanna make sure that I've said this before, that's just stuff that came out of my head. Everybody is, like, you got your own things, like, that's just me trying to get the discussion started. That is in no way meant to be a final list, those items may not even be on the final list of what the board determines, you know. That's just my thoughts, it's just to get the discussion going. So come up with your own things or your own ways of saying things.
And I think, based on what Amber did with the public and things, I think she'll be able to pull that out of us, or whether we
Yeah.
put dots on a board or vote privately or whatever we do to narrow down our top things and accumulate them and discuss, and I don't know, and then we'll have to kind of put it to things, but I think that maybe that would be, sounds to me like that would be the best avenue, is try to get.
You know
see
what would
what
be a good
DLR
thing to do in the next 4 or 5, talk to people in the community to what they think the priorities need to be, because that's, what we're here for.
But will they know all the ins and outs?
No, but it's input, it's a perspective, right?
I'm just,
You know, the farmer out in the country, they have a perspective, and so that we represent that and factor that in.
I think some of it's hard to,
The farmer.
some of it's hard to have an opinion
It's
about
cold.
if you don't know the parameters of what you're talking about. So if you don't have, like if you talk about, I want new bleachers, well, can we afford them? Do they fit? What does that look like? Without having like the softball and baseball. I absolutely think that that's important, but somebody has to do the back work and get all of the plans. So like where does that go? How much does it cost? Can you start with, if you can't buy it all now, is there a phased process you can do? I feel like before even the board looks at all of that stuff, you would have to have some of that information.
we'll have some of it. I don't know how deep I can go, because that's asking a lot of those companies to come up with that. But I think we can create a vision in some rough numbers or rough expectations.
Well, ballparks are fine.
Yes,
Ballpark
that's what it
figures
would
are
be.
fine, but like we talked about the rec, having a multi-purpose field over here. Like that's idea number 1. Is there an idea number 2 or 3? Or is there just one option and that's it?
No, that's good.
That's-
like-
that's-
Yeah, but.
Now, for this process, Kaya, I think it's with It's more focused on why you think that that has value, so that you understand what are you trying to accomplish with that, or why are you attracted to that, and that then starts to define the priorities for you as a representative of what am I looking for in a project, or, you know, and how do I prioritize things? And not necessarily, it's not really project discussions themselves, it's priorities and what we're looking for. So, and one of those priorities and that evaluation might be, hey, have we looked at several different options? Do we have an understanding of what the long-term impact is to operations and maintenance? If we have more, the more square footage, the more facilities we have, the higher the cost. Do we know what that is?
It might not be higher cost because the facilities
not
they're
be.
maintaining now are old and run down, so you might be adding more square feet, but at more efficient space.
Could be.
So, I mean, I wouldn't say it's.
But I wouldn't wanna go off
absolutely-
of just people saying, hey, here are the numbers, we have looked at this, here's the assumptions we've made to get to that point. It's really boring number stuff.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Still 1-0 or 2-0?
I don't know yet.
I'm not getting- Well, I think last meeting helped to walk through the ideas that at least the administration has put forward, and I think Drew's thing, like you said, it's his priorities. Everyone needs to probably work on their top 5 or 10 or whatever it is, however it is. I mean, and we asked Lauren to arrange with DLR, and we'll have another work session.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So is it fair to say we need to identify a top 5?
I don't know if you need to identify the projects. I mean, I guess that the process should get you there, partly.
Yes.
I mean, you're gonna come up with 5 projects, maybe then you look at that, here's why I think these are the top 5 projects, and that's your criteria.
I think it's a good start, Chris.
I mean, at least to keep
I would-
moving.
5 to 7 is what I would. But
I mean, some of this, and I agree with what Drew said, some of this stuff, you know, we've already approved the HVAC replacement, you know, call it $100,000. I mean, I think there's some other things that are probably
How do you-
in maintenance and,
so how do you put a number on safety?
Well, it's, so a lot of the way that you score it isn't that there is a safety component, it's to what degree it impacts safety. It's not that all things that, because what then you have is everybody that's justifying every single project based upon some safety angle, right? Or
Yeah,
some-
you can't do that.
And there is a safety component probably to every project. However, there is definitely different degrees of impact and value. And so they're oftentimes rated against each other to say, well, this one has a higher safety value than this one. It impacts it more, and you're looking at it in that context. So that you don't, because everybody can say, oh, this project had improved safety and and for that reason it should be approved. Well, then you don't have a process, you just have a checkbox.
I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind as we go through that is, you know, you made the point like for like and maintenance. And, you know, some of those things like the establishing a fund to go redo the turf in X number of years.
Mhm.
I mean, that's not negotiable, right?
That's good planning.
We've already bit that off, we have to go do that. And acknowledging that there are some maintenance things that, you know, they have to be at the top of the list, they are not optional, and, you know, maybe realistically, there almost needs to be 2 lists, right? There's maintenance / have to do versus want to do.
Yeah, because we've already committed to that by having that
That's my
facility
point.
now.
There is no, you know, when that turf has a big tear, then all of a sudden it is a safety issue, and if we don't have a choice but to go fix it like tomorrow. And so I think we need to make sure that we're delineating between, you know, checks that we've already written effectively, we just gotta make sure they get done, and net new that, you know, we don't have it today, and maybe we can live without it tomorrow, maybe we can't.
That's where I think some of this stuff and understanding hey, we're making decisions today based upon projected expenditures that we have in 10 years or something, you know, if we have to do, because there will be at that time, if we keep growing, that there will need to be a elementary school, something. I mean, we're gonna hit capacity if we keep growing eventually, and that's a big expense, and that we're ready for that.
Well, I mean, I don't think it hurts to identify 5. I probably said, no, I
No,
mean,
I
but
don't-
but it's, I think it's the priorities feed into that too.
Yes.
And
I think
so
everybody's
it's a
thinking
two.
it right now.
And I don't like, I mean, the idea, I kinda thought 20-some items or 30 is like almost too many too, like 2 lists. You've got, we're committed, we have to do these things and we got a want list. But, you know, and it's probably when we work through budgeting, we need to make sure that that excess in the capital carryover balance in the capital fund includes the, you know, for the turf and all that. I mean, we keep them, you know, at least $1.5 million or whatever, it's never dropped below that, but anyway.
Something else to establish, the comfort level,
Yeah.
where you want to keep that.
But you got, like Justin said, you gotta know that every year 1/10 or whatever, the first year was only that 1.5 million is like only 100,000, the next year's 200,000.
Just for me personally, when we meet with DLR and they help us through this process, do you want input from Mitch and from either the administration or myself on, because Mitch is the one that deals with probably more than half of these, obviously, and has more insight. Is that a fair?
Absolutely.
Okay,
From my
that helps.
Well, I think that it's important for an administrator from every building
Yeah,
to be
I
here,
agree.
because
Yeah.
the thing is that,
Yep.
I don't know if, I mean, just the sidewalk where you had a door that led out to grass and there wasn't even a sidewalk. I mean, how would we know that?
Right.
You know, there's, you know, the priority may be higher if there's things that,
I
you know,
agree.
we don't know.
Now, does Mitch get a vote on his baseball softball complex?
I say yes. Yes, Mitch, you can have 2 votes.
Okay.
Come on.
You know how to get carried out.
She has been paying attention.
Karen. Come on.
Oh, that's funny.
All right, anything else on that?
Good.
Let's get that scheduled, I think. Listen, we're in a great spot right now because, I mean, the administration and everybody's been very diligent and disciplined up to this point, and that's why we're in this spot right now with this project. And I'm excited for what we can do through this next step for things going forward.
Yeah,
It's good.
all right.
I think one of the things that, and I have a hard time turning off the business part of my head sometimes, but, you know, when you look at some of these bond fund balances, and I understand there's a level of conservatism that we need and we want, but, you know, we're probably earning, you know, 0.15% on these. And so if we're not investing in the core mission of education, we need to give this back to the taxpayers. I know you do it over time with mill, but I mean, to have some of these balances of, you know, 3 and 4 and 5 million in a fund that's earning us, you know, 0.15%, it really hurts my head. But time value of money is not on our side on that one, so.
I mean, it was almost, I mean, a lot of it accumulated in there, so it helped with the high school project to keep it down to 3 mils, but, I mean, I don't know what kind of planning was there, you know, anyway, I agree with that. We don't need to just sit on cash, cause it's not
That's
really
my
making any
point.
money.
We either need to, you know, either there's valuable things that we need to do for the district, or we need to give it back.
That's the point. I think, Justin, is identify what the needs are and then balance that.
What is 1 million?
Do maintenance. But anyway, any other thoughts, questions, comments from the board?
$1 per thousand of valuation.
Anyone? Going once, going twice? If not, meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
So